Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Today we're talking with Robert Louis Wilken about his new book, Liberty and the Things of God, The Christian Origins of Religious Freedom. Robert Louis Wilken is William R. Keenan Professor of the History of Christianity Emeritus at the University of Virginia. He's the author of many books, including The First 1,000 Years, The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, which I appreciated, and The Christians as the Romans Saw Them. Robert Louis Wilken, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Hey, great. So thinking about your book, this book, The Christian Origins of Religious Freedom, I want to read a passage from it, from page 1, and get your comment. You say, religious freedom is often thought to be the work of the Enlightenment. You go on to say, though, but after a half century of bloody conflict, by the middle of the 17th century, men with greater wisdom and less religious fervor in this narrative came on the scene, and the fanaticism of religious believers gave way to the cool reason of the philosophers, armed with notions of the superiority of reason over faith, skeptical of received truth, and distrustful of religious claims and institutions. These enlightened thinkers forged a new set of ideas about toleration and religious freedom. Where is that wrong? Hello?
Well,
okay.
I'm here. I'm just trying to figure out the best place to begin. The paragraph or the sentences you just read are introduction, and they are designed to set up what the book is about. And after I say that, I then go on to say that, in fact, the origins of religious freedom go back centuries to the early history of Christianity. And it was not a response to religious violence or religious conflicts in the 16th century, but was initially a response to the persecution of Christians by the Romans. And one particular thinker, a man named Tertullian, who lived in North Africa in the city of Carthage in the early 3rd century, defended his Christian community, and he wrote a little treatise to the provincial governor. And in that treatise, he said this: "It is only just and a privilege inherent in human nature that every person should be able to worship according to his own convictions. The religious practice of one person neither harms nor helps another. It is not part of religion to coerce religious practice, for it is by choice, not coercion, that we should be led to religion." Now, he wrote that at the early 3rd century, and the ideas that he represented were based really on the Christian understanding of certain biblical notions. One of them, namely, that human beings are created free. That means that they have the ability to do what they desire to do, to choose, and to act on it. And other writers said pretty much the same thing. Another Latin writer, Tertullian wrote in Latin, another Latin writer by the name of Lactantius at the beginning of the 4th century said, religion is not capable of being coerced. Religion cannot be coerced. Now, these statements remained in these manuscripts. And over the course of the next 1,000 years or more, they were referred to and used by various Christian writers. But basically, by the 4th century, Christianity had become the religion of the Roman world. And so Christians began to behave the way other rulers had, and they suppressed and persecuted people who differed from them: Jews, heretics, people who held to the old Roman religion. Someone used the phrase once that religious freedom is really a loser's creed. It's one thing to say that you should be free to practice your religion when you are being persecuted, and it's quite another thing to say when you are the ruler and you have control of the political authority.
Yeah. Let me ask you this
So
question. Go ahead.
Okay.
One question.
So the point being is that what was written in these early centuries was remembered but not really applied, except in some limited situations. And so what happened in the 16th century with the emergence of the Reformation is that these texts from antiquity began to be remembered because they were now being edited. It was the time of the Renaissance, and people read them and they said, well, this looks very much like the situation we're having today, except today it's Christians persecuting Christians. And so then over the next 150 years, ideas which had first been advanced in the early centuries were now taken up, adapted, expanded, deepened, and then people began to create really a conception of religious freedom. So the point I want to make is this, is that religious freedom does not develop full-blown in the early church or in the biblical period, but it's something that builds on that capital and then adjusts to the realities that came about because of the Reformation.
Let's talk more specifically, the subtitle of your book, The Christian Origins of Religious Freedom. Let's maybe talk more about that. You have, throughout the book, commentary on the meaning of conscience as various Christian thinkers understand that, from Tertullian all the way up to John Calvin, Martin Luther, Thomas Aquinas. Speak about that, and because conscience, knowledge with, is something that Christianity transforms.
The term conscience, as you just said, comes from the Latin word scientia, which means knowledge, and con, which is the word for wit. So in contrast to simple knowledge, conscience is knowledge with, means that it's available to others besides oneself, and therefore carries a kind of moral imperative. In antiquity, the term was used by, say, writers such as Seneca, the Latin writer, to talk about what one did, and one's conscience then brought that to mind. And so one would have a clean conscience if the things that one did were worthy of approval, and if not, then one would have an evil conscience or a bad conscience, and we still use the word that way. But with the rise of Christianity, initially with the Apostle Paul, the term conscience came to have a future meaning. It was almost a kind of tutor or pedagogue to the soul as to what one should do. And over the centuries, and this comes up in a writer such as Thomas Aquinas, they began to understand that conscience was not simply what one had in one's mind, but actually was a mandate to act in a certain way. And so there are a number of examples in the Middle Ages where individuals were criticized for their views, and they appealed to conscience because they said their conscience, that is the knowledge that they possess, and specifically about divine matters, required them to act on them, which means not to submit to those who claimed that they were teaching false doctrine. And so that's the way it was developed. And then one of the most striking examples is in the early 16th century, right at the very beginning of the Reformation, a Franciscan sister living in Nuremberg, where the city magistrates had begun to impose Lutheranism on the city and to close the monasteries. She said that you do not allow me the freedom of conscience, and you have been preaching that we should be free to confess what we believe. And so it enters into the Reformation period. And so one writer after another appealed to conscience as a kind of spiritual knowledge or intuition that's obedient to God. Conscience does not mean, at least in the classical sense, does not mean the right of private judgment. It's about obedience. obedience to an internal demand that one gets from one's knowledge of God.
But thinking about so much of your book in the opening chapters is about Christianity and the Roman Empire. Help us understand, because so much of your book turns on these arguments that are made in the early church, which then get picked up and developed later on, many centuries later. But what do the Christians confront in terms of a conception of religion in that period of the empire, and what do they bring to the table in terms of which you said earlier, men are created free?
Well, I think the most important thing, and it's something that persists well into the early modern period, is that religion was an affair of the community as a whole. It was not a matter of a private religious group. Everyone living in the city or in the community would confess the same religion. That meant that they kept the same calendar, they celebrated the same festivals, and they lived according to rules and regulations that were common for everybody else. And this continued right up into the Reformation period. And the Romans were really quite magnanimous, and they were willing to accept religions that came from pretty much from the Middle East into the cities of the Roman Empire, as long as they didn't insist that they were to separate the religious community from the civic community. I quote a passage from the Latin writer Tacitus, historian, who talks about the rebuilding of the capital. That's where the center of the city of Rome after it had been destroyed. And it was a civic as well as a religious event. So you had senators, you had public officials, and you had religious priests and the people. But they were all part of one community. The Christians come along and they refuse to participate, particularly in the sacrifices that were just taken for granted. And so that was then an affront. And as one governor said, why don't you go along with what we believe? Why do you have to be different? We are religious people. Can't you follow our way of being religious? And the Christians said no. The Jews, the Romans found a way to accommodate them, but the Christians, because the Jews were people, they had their own land, they had their own unique history. But Christians were just people pulled from all over society. And so the Romans were offended and therefore began to persecute them. And it was in that context that Tertullian said people should be free to choose their religion. They shouldn't be forced to do what the government wants us to do.
So there's an inkling or the beginning of a sense of the church is a separate society within.
Very good point.
Order. Yeah.
Very good point. In fact, I give a couple of examples of that Tertullian in another writing, he actually says that we are a body, we are a corpus, we are a community, and we come together for prayer, to read the scriptures, to have our leaders admonish us as to how to live, to collect offerings to help those who are in need. And so he presents Christianity as an independent, distinctive body, different from the city or the state. And that's then very formative. And for the whole history, Christianity understands itself as a community that's set apart, called out, and has its own leaders, its own rituals, its own teachings, its own practices that are different from what the general populace practices. Now, of course, what happens is that Christianity triumphs, and so then everybody becomes Christian, and unfortunately, then they behave the same way that the Romans did.
Yeah.
For dissenters. Yeah. And so what the story of the book is to show how that particular conviction began to be modified in the 16th and the 17th century.
The thing about, you write in the beginning about Gelasius and his well-known statement of, two swords there are by which the world is ruled. That will be picked up by Protestant reformers in different ways. John Calvin has, the two powers.
Right. Well, let me just
Luther has another aspect of that as well. And yet it seems so often, and I think this is why there's this power of the conventional account of the Enlightenment giving us religious freedom, is that the swords get blended and Christians in the public and religious realm struggle to know how to separate them, even though there's conceptual clarity, practical clarity, power, the disputes over power blend them so easily. And so we have this sort of interminable problem.
Yeah, well, what happened several centuries after Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire and of the Roman world, it became apparent that the emperor and the Pope, the primary religious leader for Christians in the West, had different concerns. And so a pope by the name of Gelasius in the 6th century wrote a letter to the emperor Anastasius, and he said, you as an emperor have no authority to determine religious matters. You can't tell us how to worship. You can't tell us what we should believe. You can't tell us what practices we should follow. And so what happened is then a notion of two powers. It goes back actually to Jesus. Render to Caesar the things that are of Caesar, and to God the things that are of God. And that then becomes a fixture of Christian thinking. But in the Middle Ages, it was all within one Christian political and religious community. What happens in the 16th century with the Reformation is that the religious community becomes distinct from the political community. And so the notion that there are two powers, that there are two swords, takes on a wholly new meaning. And as you said, a person like John Calvin makes that very, very explicit. He says that the ends of the civil society are to provide peace and security and stability, and the ends of the religious community are to worship God. And that then becomes really the foundation on which the notion of separation of church and state is built.
So let's think about this. In many chapters in your book, you touch on arguments for religious freedom, freedom of conscience, in the course of the Reformation. And so you go through discrete communities in Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, England. You touch on things in the North American colonies. You tell a story, which I was not aware of James Madison becoming aware of the persecution of the Baptists, a few miles from Montpelier. I thought that was an interesting story of thinking about his opposition to the levy in favor of pastors. And thinking about that. So let's talk about that. How do these various people like Caritas Pirkheimer, the Augustinian sister, how do they pick up on these arguments you identify in a much earlier Christian period and then develop them?
Well, in the case of, she's a Franciscan, not an Augustinian, it's Franciscan sister. I am sure that, as she was educated before she became a sister, a religious sister, part of her formation and the members of her community was about conscience, and that conscience was a unique gift that people had been given, and she understood then in what circumstances it would work. If you jump over to England at the time of the English Reformation, you find that Thomas More and other prominent Catholic figures make an appeal to the same understanding of conscience. If you turn to the Netherlands, you find that people, and here you're talking about Protestants, make an appeal to the same understanding of conscience, and conscience must be free. It must be able to choose and make its own decisions. So the point I try to make is not that conscience is something that comes from the Reformation. It's not anything. It's something that all Christians shared. Whether you were Roman Catholic or whether you were Anglican or whether you were a dissenter, a separatist, or whether you were a French Calvinist. It's something that they all received from the medieval church and then applied in different ways in their different situations. And then it comes to the point. Yeah.
Think about the more problematic aspects too, in which you see established authorities say, no, I'm not denying your liberty of conscience. You're free to think and to believe in what you want. You can worship privately, but there's an established order we're responsible for, a public order we have to protect, and we think it is necessary to give support to this doctrinal understanding of Christianity. Therefore, you're out of luck when it comes to any sort of public communal expression of belief. How does that problematize this understanding of conscience, and what sort of responses do we see to that?
Very important point. And the case, I think, is particularly clear in England.
England's
with the Reformation.
I thought in your book, the example of England was the most fascinating one, because there are problems from all sides.
It's in a way the most significant.
Yeah.
Because England in the 17th century was the most contentious society, religiously speaking, because you had an established church, which was Anglican, with a strong influence of Calvinism. You had Roman Catholics, and then you had separatists or dissenters, people who had stopped going to the parish church. But the laws of the land required that if you were a citizen living in a city or a town, that you were obligated to go to the parish church. As Richard Hooker, a great 16th century Anglican thinker, put it, there's no difference between being a member of the Commonwealth and being a member of the church. You're the member of one, you're a member of the other. And so people began to absent themselves from the parish church and to have their own gatherings. And they would pray and sing and preach and admonish one another. Well, as you just explained, what the authorities said, well, we don't have anything against you believing something different. We just don't want you to practice anything different. We don't want you to be absent from the parish church. And here, one English writer, a man by the name of John Owen, he's not a name that's well known, but he's a very, very important figure. And, in certain circles, he would be very well known. He made the argument, and he's really drawing here on ideas developed in the Middle Ages, that conscience is not just an inner opinion. Conscience mandates action. And he wrote several essays.
Why does he
develop
how does he talk about that for a minute, that connection between an inner realm of something you believe and now there's action? Talk about that.
Well, he's drawing on Thomas Aquinas, who says that conscience is not a power, it's not a habit, it's an action. That is, the very nature of conscience, having to do with religious matters, has to do with what you're going to do, not just what you believe. And so Owen says, if it is an act, then you have to respect the actions, the practices that people do on the basis of what their conscience is teaching them or telling them. So that's probably in some ways the most significant kind of intellectual move with the understanding of conscience, because it was never a question. In fact, there's almost no evidence at all, that whether people were prohibited from holding certain things, but if they would teach them or they would practice them, that was quite a different matter.
Yeah.
And so he really cuts right through there, and he says that freedom of conscience has to do with freedom to practice, not simply to believe.
Well, that's another, just important point,
and which, by the way, has a very contemporary application, because the issues of religious freedom in our time have to do more with actions.
Yes.
That is, whether you are going to prohibit people from having access to birth control, for example. Or there was a case a few years ago in Michigan. It had to do with Lutheran parochial school teachers.
Hosanna Tabor.
And that
right. The Hosanna Tabor case, that was interesting because you see the court realize that religious freedom must also attach to institutions. And they they come very close to a freedom of the church principle in that decision. Thinking, it's also the case, John Owen, I remember clearly that chapter in your book because Owen was appointed by the Cromwell government the day after the execution of Charles I to give sort of a long sermon outlining, and I think he outlines a lot of these principles of religious freedom. But the irony there is rich, and that they've just overthrown constitutional government in England, and then here's John Owen talking about religious freedom. What did you think of that?
Yeah, well, no, for me, he was a relatively new name, and I read quite a bit of him when I was working on this. And one of the beauties of John Owen, in terms of the argument of the book, is that he knew all of these texts from the early church.
Yeah.
Tertullian and Lactantius, and he had some others to it, and he quotes them. They all, in those years, learned people were absolutely fluent in Latin, in not only reading but speaking and writing. And so he quotes the sources. He's for me, a very important testimony that these ancient writings were still very much alive in the middle of the 17th century.
Yeah, I think so. Let me come at this another way, because I'm interested to get your response. Some have argued with the Reformation and the breakout of Protestant thinking, and one principle of Protestant thinking being individual judgment about divine matters, not a corporate judgment. Right. That this sort of invites that the Reformation really leads not to religious freedom but to the modern state. And not just the chaos of the Reformation, but that there's something about it, individual judgment, paradoxically leading to the empowerment of the state, and also sort of the elimination, really, of any competitor to the state, say the Catholic Church, and this sort of invites the growth of the modern nation state. What do you think of that?
Well, I think, I clearly, from what I'd said before, the notion of individual judgment is really quite a step away from what was going on.
Okay.
Because in almost all cases, there are some exceptions. The really big exception is the case of Servetus, who was executed in Geneva during the time that John Calvin was there, and John Calvin actually supported his execution. So there you have a case of an individual, a single individual, being persecuted and then executed because of his beliefs. But almost every other instance has to do with religious communities. And so what people are appealing to is the beliefs of their religious association, their religious society, their church, if you wish. And in some ways, I think that's probably the most important, for me, unexpected conclusion in writing the book, that religious freedom as it emerges and liberty of conscience has primarily to do with religious communities. not with individuals.
Let me.
Of course, it presupposes individual belief, but nevertheless, that's not the way it actually developed.
Yeah. Now, your thoughts on this principle that also emerged in the beginning of the modern nation states in the West, that the belief of the prince would be the belief of the realm. How does that sort of problematize the religious belief of the prince would become the required religion of the realm or of the state? How does that does that problematize your book, or is it just a part of the complexity of the period?
Well, no, I do discuss it. I don't go into it in great length, but that was actually a very positive development, because people believe still, even after the beginning of the Reformation, that you needed to have one religion in a city or in a territory if there was going to be social cohesion and peace. And so what that basically did was said, the prince, or in terms of the city, the magistrates of the city, what they believe is what the people believe. And those who don't believe that, they're going to have to get out. They're going to have to move somewhere else. Or they kind of live their lives somewhat in secret, though people would know that. And then when Sunday came, or religious holidays came, they would go out of the city and meet in the countryside, maybe in the home of a wealthy member. And so it, in a sense, it was a positive response to religious division, which is what everybody feared.
Okay.
But, of course, it wasn't a sufficient response, and eventually it proved unworkable. And that was particularly the case, as we've already said it, in England. I mean, the French had the same problem, and they came up with a solution with the so-called Edict of Nantes, the end of the 16th century. And it meant recognizing, tolerating, basically, religious dissenters under certain conditions. But 100 years later, the king basically revoked the Edict of Nantes, and so Catholicism went back to the historic pattern: one faith, one king, one law.
Servetus's execution, supported by John Calvin. John Calvin defends his role. You write about that in the book. John Calvin also has religious freedom principles we've been discussing. He tries to separate the public realm from the religious realm.
Right.
He disputes with magistrates of Geneva their interference in the religious realm, and yet the execution of Servetus. But also, he seems also to suggest that the public realm should support religion in various ways. So what do we make of all of that?
Well, Calvin is ambiguous. Calvin realized that his principle could not be effectively applied across the board. And he also believed that there should be unity and cohesion and stability in society. And so he's a divided man. And what's so interesting about Calvin is that you can get either side in his writings. And he was aware of that, and he acknowledges it. And if you jump 100 years later, almost 100 years later, maybe 80 or 90 years later, to Rhode Island, and Roger Williams gets into trouble because he is not willing to follow the official religion of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he gets into an argument with John Cotton, who is their leading spokesman. And basically, Cotton takes one side of Calvin, and Williams takes the other side of Calvin. They're both Calvinists, but they're taking different ideas from him.
What do you make of that? What do you make of that? Say John Calvin contains multitudes. Why do you think he contains multitudes?
Well, for one thing, he's a very rich thinker, and he was also a very honest thinker, and he recognized that there was something profoundly true about having one religion for the whole community. And after all, that's the way it had been for 1,500 years. And the scriptures give support for that, because of Romans 13, that the magistrate is basically there as an appointed official by God, and that power is given to him. So I respect Calvin for that. I mean, Calvin is so rich a thinker, and he really has a lot of impact. But the impact that he has primarily has to do with the notion of there are two orders. There's a civil order and there's a religious order.
Yeah.
He talks about conscience, but for him, see, one of the things you have to understand about conscience is that in the Middle Ages and in the early decades of the Reformation, conscience was being able, at least in Calvin's case, being able to practice what you believed contrary to the church's rules. So it was basically a freedom from the church.
The Catholic Church.
So if you thought that there were certain regulations about fasting, for example, about obligations to go to confession or obligations to go to church on certain days, what he's talking about is the freedom of conscience not to have to submit to the bishop or to the clergy. But within a few decades, it becomes less an inner church conflict. It becomes a religious community over against political authority that represents a different church.
Okay.
So it's really a wholly new thing, because now conscience is being exercised over against political authority, not religious authority.
Therein lies great danger. Thinking about Martin Luther, and I don't want to be too general here, but it seems one detects the same sort of difficulties in his thought in terms of the way he's able to separate religion and find space for religious freedom for different church communities within a state. But yet when push comes to shove, also seems to come down with a heavy hand on the public side.
He does indeed. And he actually said that even though he writes an early book in which he says that you have to keep these two kingdoms, which is the word that he uses, separate. They have completely different purposes, goals, ends. Yet he wanted also to have peace, because he was troubled by the Anabaptists. And they were much too radical because they rejected infant baptism. And Luther thought infant baptism was the foundational teaching of the church. And so he writes to his prince, and he says, there should only be one kind of preaching in a territory. So Luther can be used on either side, if one wishes. And so within the Lutheran lands, that the principle that you mentioned earlier about that the prince or the magistrates decide the religion was most effectively instituted and then applied for several generations.
You also discuss in the book John Locke and the way he changes, which I was not aware of, the way he changes his views on religious freedom. But unlike other thinkers of the period, he doesn't primarily build on citations to more ancient or medieval Christian sources, or even all the Bible in his defense of religious freedom. He's employing philosophical concepts, but yet concepts you say are impossible to understand absent Christian revelation.
Well, that's exactly right. All of Locke's ideas and the two principal ideas that he expresses are, first, that the ends of the civil society and the ends of religious society are different. There he's basically following Calvin, though he doesn't really quote Calvin. And the second thing is that religious faith is an inner conviction and therefore cannot be coerced. In other words, his basic ideas in his letter concerning toleration derive directly from the whole tradition of Christian thought. But he's a philosopher. He's not a theologian. And one of his, I think, accomplishments is that he presents these ideas as reasonable on their own terms, which is, I think, a great acknowledgement of the way in which Christian thought works. When Christians assert certain fundamental ideas, such as the freedom of the human being, they aren't asserting just Christian ways of thinking. They're talking about what's true for all human beings. And so what Locke does is he basically expresses what's true. Yeah. It may have been discerned through Christian thinking, but stands on its own. And that's why Locke's ideas could be so readily accepted and applied by someone like James Madison. He doesn't have to quote a Bible passage.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to quote Tertullian.
It's there. It's in the air. It's a currency he can.
Well, it's in the air. I mean, it's also part of his intellectual formation. Yes. He had studied with John Witherspoon at Princeton or the College of New Jersey.
Yeah.
And so these ideas became second nature to him. So he doesn't even realize their source.
The debt. You say early in the book, you mean to defend religious freedom, not toleration. And I want to now at the end, and you note a interesting connection of a sort between Thomas Jefferson on religious freedom and Tertullian, someone we've been discussing, who was from the 3rd century of the Roman Empire in Carthage. But I want to ask a critical question here at the end. Tertullian said, and Thomas Jefferson said something kind of similar, that the religious belief of my neighbor doesn't affect me, shouldn't affect me. Right. And I'm thinking about, sort of, I think part of this conversation, part of your book is how Christians get it so wrong, even though we have these principles, and Christians in government get it so wrong. And is it the case that Tertullian may be wrong, that the religious beliefs of our neighbors profoundly affect us precisely because of who human beings are? And what we say, what we believe affects our actions and will affect the public realm.
Well, of course they do. And that's, of course, the way in which Christian faith spread. I mean, most people who have not been raised in a Christian family become a Christian because of some person that they came to know, whose life, whose thinking they came to admire. And so there's no question. But what Tertullian is saying is that it's something that you can't coerce. You can't force a person. And so there has to be an element of persuasion. He doesn't go into that. And so I think in that sense, and the context in which Jefferson says that, it's in his notes from the state of Virginia, he's talking about the establishment, the Anglican establishment, that actually forced people, as it did in England, to attend the parish church and to become a member of the religious community, which was the public religious expression of the civil community. And that's what's bothering him, and that's what's bothering Madison. That is what I think the story that I've told helps to explain why Madison said the things he did. I didn't actually discuss Jefferson because he knew the passage.
It's an appendix, I think, isn't it?
Right.
The Jefferson.
And earlier on, I thought I would put him into the story, but I realized I was not able to draw any direct line.
Okay.
But I could with Madison, because I know that Madison had read this book and he had read Locke. And so I decided to stop there and put Tertullian Jefferson into an appendix. I mean, the truth of the matter is I've spent my life in the ancient world reading the church fathers. And for me to try to presume to talk about Thomas Jefferson, I think would be a serious intellectual blunder. And so I did what I could, and I think I made an effective point about Jefferson, and I think I can make more about Madison. But I knew where to stop.
Yeah. Robert Louis Wilken, thank you so much for discussing your new book with us, Liberty in the Things of God, The Christian Origins of Religious Freedom. Thank you. This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.